Back in the early 90s when I was a young boy, just starting high school, I moved out of my mother's home due to personal family problems. My uncle and auntie took me in and welcomed me into their home and brought me up from this point. The house we lived in at the time was a small 2-bedroomed house that I shared with my cousin, my younger cousin, who was my aunt and uncle's daughter. My cousin and myself shared a room, and for a short period of time I slept on the floor in a sleeping bag. However, this wasn't for long, and we all eventually moved from this small house into a larger 3-bedroomed house where I got my own bedroom and life began to feel like it was getting back on track. It was in this house that I started to have some strange experiences, and so did my aunt and uncle. All of us seemed to experience some kind of paranormal activity at some point. Apart from my cousin, she never really seemed to experience anything. Now, before we start, I'm afraid I can't remember the order that the strange happenings occurred, but I will try and remember to the best of my abilities. The house couldn't have been more than 100 years old, and didn't particularly look haunted. It was just an ordinary British house, not that much unlike the Black Monk of Pontefract house, or if you're familiar with the other case, the Enfield Poltergeist house. Now, as you entered the house, you stood in a small hallway. There was a living room directly in front of the front door, which followed directly into the kitchen, a parlour or dining room if you want to call it, directly to the right, and stairs to the left, which led upstairs to the toilet, separate bathroom, my room, my aunt and uncle's room, and my cousin's room. All the rooms branched off from the landing and the small hallway downstairs. I remember when we all first arrived through the front door to see the dirty floorboards in the dimly lit rooms with light bulbs hanging from the ceiling with no shades. The previous owners had completely stripped the house clean. For a few weeks we lived without carpets, making do with rugs that we had brought from the old house and laid out here and there, so as you can imagine, the house was full of echoes. When I lived with my mother, my nights were full of nightmares, and I slept with the light on all the time. But in my new home I wanted to be brave. I felt I was getting too old for being afraid of the dark. I made my way up the creaky stairs and found my new bedroom. I arranged my few belongings and made my new bed and was feeling quite happy and content. And then, when it came to bedtime, I plucked up the courage and flicked the lights out and crawled into bed and wrapped myself tightly up into a ball. The reason I did this was due to a reoccurring nightmare I had as a child, where I dreamt I was pulled out of my bedroom window by my feet. At this time in my life, this was the only way I knew how to fall asleep. It was the only way I felt safe in bed. As I began to relax in my new room, I began to drift off to sleep, when all of a sudden I heard a loud bang and my name being called. And with that, I shot up in my bed. I was frozen with fear, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at my window. I could have swore the sound came from my window, but as for who called my name, I'm not too sure. You see, everybody in the house was fast asleep. I calmed myself and eventually fell back asleep, confident it was just another nightmare, or at least that is what I was telling myself. The next day I awoke and joined my family downstairs. There was no butter in the house, so we popped across the road to the corner shop to buy bread, butter and milk. This was when I noticed a building next to the shop. It was a funeral home, of course complete with a parlour of rest, right across the road from our new house. And this will play a part in my story later on. Not much happened at first, but what I can say is that there was a very dark, uncomfortable feeling at the very top of the stairs. It's hard to explain really, I just know I didn't like hanging around at the top when ascending or descending the stairs. I always expected to be pushed down the steps by invisible hands, but I must stress this never happened, although I did have a few nightmares about the stairs where I was either pushed or pulled back up against my will. But the only reason I mention this is because at the time I kept this to myself. It was only in my adult life that I found out that my uncle and my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, all felt a bad vibe at the top of the stairs, and we never spoke of it at the time. At first I didn't see anything in the house, but I heard plenty. I remember one day I was home alone and I was sitting downstairs reading the book, and all of a sudden I could hear what sounded like organ music, or church music if you like. It was coming from upstairs. At first this didn't alarm me. You see, my uncle's alarm clock had a habit of playing music whenever it felt like it, and I normally would just go upstairs to his room and simply press the off switch. However, as I ascended the stairs, the music stopped, so I came back down. As soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the music started again. It was faint, but I could hear it. And once again, as I ascended the stairs, the music stopped again. However, I went to my aunt and uncle's room to make sure that the alarm clock was off, and it was. As soon as I got back to the bottom of the stairs, the organ music started again, very faintly, but I could hear it. But each time I went up the stairs, and once again it stopped. A little creeped out, I decided to take the dog for a walk, and when I returned, the music had stopped completely. I heard a few more unusual sounds in that house, mainly the knocking at my bedroom window or the calling of my name as I fell asleep, which happened on and off during my young life in the house. But one night, as I lay in my room, I started to hear voices coming from the attic, a mixture of laughing and conversation, but like the organ music, faint. It was very faint. I walked out of my room to be greeted by my uncle on the landing. Thank God he could hear it too, coming directly from above our heads. It's hard to explain how, but my uncle got the impression there was a game of cards being played in the attic by these disembodied voices. The voices didn't last long and stopped not long after we stepped onto the landing, but every now and again they would start up again, especially at night time. The attic door, however, was situated in the bathroom ceiling, and it's in the bathroom that something strange happened to my aunt a few weeks later. She had returned home one night from work to an empty house. I'm not sure where the rest of us were, I can't quite remember, but what I can say for sure is that she was home alone. She came home, went upstairs and began to run a bath. When it was ready, she closed the bathroom door and got into the tub. After about 5 minutes, she claimed the lights in the bathroom were switched off and she was sat there in pitch black darkness. She carefully got out of the tub, opened the door and flicked the light switch back on, which was situated on the outside of the room. She noticed the bedroom and the landing lights were also turned off. She flicked them all back on as well and got back into the tub, a bit confused. 5 minutes later, the lights went out again, followed by a giggle, a faint giggle, a child's giggle, but like the voices, very, very faint. She once again got out of the tub and flicked the lights on, including the bedroom and the landing, which had gone out again. What she initially thought is that myself and my cousin had returned home and we were playing a prank on her. But after discovering that myself and my cousin were still out, she decided to dry herself off and got dressed and went downstairs to watch TV with the dog and tried to dismiss what had just happened. One particular night I was sat in my bed watching TV. I was flicking through the TV channels when I stopped on a documentary on the devil or religion, I can't quite remember exactly. After about 30 seconds of this programme being played on my small TV, my bed started to violently shake and rumble. My room was so small my bed was trapped in between two walls, so it couldn't go anywhere, but it did shake like mad, banging on the floor and on the walls. I threw off the covers, jumped out of bed and spun round just in time to witness the bed stop shaking and come to rest, just like that. After I regained my calm, my initial thought was an earthquake, or a very big truck must have drove past outside. I ran downstairs asking my aunt and uncle if they had felt any shaking of any kind, and of course they didn't. Now, when I thought back on what I was watching on the TV, a programme about religion, it always makes me wonder whether something in my bedroom simply wanted me to change the channel. On another night, as I lay awake in my bed in darkness, I watched my school bag start to shake and rustle about on my floor, as though there was a small kitten playing inside it. And of course, when I switched on the light and looked inside, there was nothing there apart from my school books. I just want to say before we go any further, all of these things happened over a few years, not over a few days or a few weeks, more like every couple of months we would hear something or see something. So I've discussed the sounds in my house. Now I'll start to tell you about the apparitions. First of all, I'll tell you about something that woke me up by calling my name again whilst I slept in my room. At this point in my life I'd gotten over my fear and was now sleeping with my legs completely fully down and I had no nightmares. I was a little bit older and a little bit more rational and now completely comfortable with sleeping in the dark. So, on this particular night, once again I'm fast asleep. And once again, I am awoken by a voice saying my name, but this time it wasn't loud in my head, it was said softly, and I didn't wake up in any state of panic. I simply opened my eyes, and then I saw her standing over me. It was the perfect silhouette of a woman, in a flowing dress with long hair hanging down next to her shoulders. She was almost a shadow, but I got the sense her dress was floral. The thing is, I was only shaken for a second as I looked up at her, and she looked down at me. and then I felt a wave of calm, and then she disappeared. It all lasted about 5 seconds, maybe 10. As soon as she vanished, I fell back asleep. On another night, my uncle was sitting on the couch watching television, when all of a sudden, he said he saw me enter the room and walk directly across and enter the kitchen, but I didn't acknowledge him. He got up from the couch and followed me into the kitchen, but to his shock, the kitchen was completely empty, and then he remembered I wasn't even in the house that night. One day, I was home alone, in my room, and I was very ill. I had a bad case of the flu, and my temperature was quite high. I was sleeping on and off. You know what it's like when you're sick, it's hard to stay asleep. The pain keeps you in and out of consciousness. It was still morning time, and I was once again awoken by a male voice saying my name. I rolled over in my bed thinking it was my uncle, only to see a solid figure of a man in a black suit sat next to my bed staring at me. But his face was void of features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. His face was a complete blank canvas. The best way I can describe him to you is that he looked a little bit like Slender Man, but Slender Man was decades from being thought up. In the 90s, he simply didn't exist. The strange faceless man spoke to me, but for the life of me, I can't remember what he said, but I felt it was a warning, and then he simply vanished into thin air. Now I must say, I put this down to just being ill and having a fever dream, but I still thought it was worth mentioning, because when I think back about this, I can't help but wonder if what I saw was something more than simply a fever dream. The last experience I had in this house is the one I'm convinced actually happened. It was around 7 PM. The sun was slowly going down, but there was still a little light. We had a guest around that night, and myself and my uncle stood against the wall in the living room chatting to our guests, who had all filled up the couch and chairs. As I stood against the wall, I heard 3 distinct knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. From where I stood, I could see a clear view of the front door in the hallway. The front door had a single pane of glass which ran down the centre. The glass was slightly frosted, but it wasn't frosted enough that you couldn't see someone on the other side. So I heard 3 knocks, and right there, as clear as day, was a small, blonde-haired child on the other side of the door. I was a bit concerned because of the hour the child was knocking at the door. As I approached the door, I never took my eyes off the child's mop of blonde hair on the other side of the glass. I grabbed the door handle, and as I turned the handle, I could still see the small head on the other side of the glass. But when I swung the door open, there was no one there. I walked outside, there was no one around. I came back in, I closed the door and inspected the glass. It was clear, no one was on the other side. I'm certain of what I saw, and to back me up, my uncle also heard the knocks and saw the child's head. Now, if you remember I mentioned the funeral parlour, well, here's where it ties into my story. Apparently, at the same time as the apparition of the child appeared on the opposite side of my front door, the funeral parlour across the street had just received a young blonde-headed boy, and he was being kept in the chapel of rest, awaiting his funeral. And I found out at a later date from a neighbour. And I must say that I had never mentioned any of these strange happenings in the house to any of my neighbours, simply because I didn't want anyone to think I was insane. It's only now when I think back to the time I lived in that house if that chapel of rest had anything to do with the things that I experienced in that house. And when I think back to the man sitting at the side of my bed with no face, the one who resembled Slender Man, what may or may not have been a fever dream, I always wonder if he had simply taken a walk from the funeral home across to my house. After all, he was dressed in his best, a smart black suit, not unlike the last suit you will ever wear when you were placed in your coffin. Since that house I have lived in 3 different properties, and I've never experienced anything like I did in that house. And now I have my own family, a wife and 2 children, and I always reinforce that there is nothing to be scared of in the dark, and ghosts don't exist, even if I don't believe it myself.